Art, Language, and Science, the Ice Age. In this lecture, we're going to review what we talked about in the last lecture, a review of progress, historical significance, and then we're going to ask a little bit about prehistoric science. Is it possible? And we'll end with the idea of writing in science. As historians, we have the duty to decide what truly happened, what's significant, and if anything could have happened any other way. That's the essence of historical thinking. And we spend a lot of time arguing about what's significant. Now, science is usually a discussion of discovery and of progress. So the history of science is the story of significance and progress. If we look at the overview of the course, we can see that many of the narratives about science and technology focus on the tools of science and technology getting better. But the story we really want to tell is that our lives got better. Progress equals my life is better. There are basic human needs that we use science to reach. Even things we might call communal or spiritual get attention from scientists. For instance, having a long life free of disease, having access to clean water and air, having enough to eat and drink, having enough to live, and a place that's not too hot or cold, with enough space. Having something meaningful to do that provides the necessities of life, and something that allows you to enjoy leisure and culture and art, being part of a family or being a valued member of a community. Sometimes we just want to harness the big forces of nature so they don't overwhelm us or hurt us, but instead help us. And you could also say that some spiritual goals are occasionally scientific goals, like being at peace or being just, or even living forever, being good or wise, being nothing, stopping suffering, and knowing God. Well, one question that you can ask about any change in history, but which is really relevant to science, is this question of significance. Has a change or discovery been really significant? So we just talked about progress. Now we're talking about significance. Significance is a question of history. It's a judgment about the rate and proportions and force of change in our lives caused by the discoveries in science. For instance, something like the clock is a permanent change in cultural practice. We're not going to go back and stop using clocks. Then you can think about significance as a question of magnitude. How many people are affected by what we're doing? It might matter to me or my family or my city or my state or my country, my culture, my way of life. It matters even to my civilization. Then there's something you could call potential. Some innovations contain enormous future potential growth, like the printing press. And there are other changes in significance. For instance, the quality of something could fall off or could get better significantly. Like tomatoes now versus ones from my childhood. That's definitely fallen off. Tomatoes from the garden taste way better than the tomatoes that have been sent on a truck across the country. You could ask, does something feel, taste, or function differently? That's a question of quality. So we said permanence and magnitude, potential, and quality are the terms by which significance is discussed and evaluated. But there's also negative significance. You could say someone or something is gone. Some avenue to a benefit can't be pursued. Someone is in power who just wouldn't otherwise not be in power, or some structure is impossible to undo without a lot of time and trouble. This is a kind of significant loss. All right, now let's get back to our definitions. We had said last time that science is tool-assisted knowledge gathering for the purpose of explaining mysterious causes and effects. Now I'm going to give you another definition here. In order to improve our lives and satisfy our curiosity, we use specialized instruments to make new and repeated observations so that we can explain the hidden causes of events and predict future events. So these are two definitions, and if you look at them, you can see that observation and repetition are in it. Information storage is part of it. Tool-assisted knowledge gathering, instrumentation is part of science. Understanding cause and effect is part of science, and you could note to yourself that cause and effect has a kind of ritualistic feel to it. And then last but not least, you could say that in both definitions, we're kind of wondering, how does the world work? There's a sense of the sublime, the thing that is beyond us, that makes us feel small. All right, so today's lecture is partly about this question of significance and progress and science itself, but it's also about this question of prehistoric science. Is there really such a thing? The author of the book that we're using in this course, Science of 4,000 Year History, she starts with Babylon. Patricia Farrer, her name is. She starts with Babylon, which is a society that did record keeping of the stars. And she says you really can't have science unless you have an organized society that has a written language and kept records of observations that you can go back to. And I think she's right, but I also think that science is a kind of problem solving. And so I wanted to challenge or think a little bit about this idea of science in prehistory. For instance, what are the problems that we've solved in prehistory? And there's evidence that we solved them. Tools and eating, extinction and domestication, observation of animals and people, and the passages of time. Let's take a look at that. So first of all, just a quick look at the map of the tools of finds and fossils for one of the modern human precursors, Homo erectus. So pretty early on, wherever humans seem to be, maybe not modern humans, but someone certainly part of the human history, as soon as you find them, you find tools together with them. And you can see that all the way around the world. I think that's just interesting to look at. Now, the big question you might ask yourself if you are a tool user and you're faced with a world full of animals is, how do I get something to eat that won't kill me? Now, if you have Netflix, you might want to have a look at this video. This is Michael Pollan's series called Cooked on Netflix. It's the fire episode. And this particular episode argues that eating cooked meat helped us develop the jaw muscles that made us use language and be human. Now, there are a lot of arguments floating around like that. XYZ made us human. Eating, cooking, art, tool using, language. There's some kind of feedback loop that made us become fully human. Now, this is not the argument that I'm making in the course, but it's really one you might want to ponder. Can doing something change who you are? Now, most of us would say both no and yes to that. Well, my argument in this little section is really that there is evidence of a particular kind of thinking that shows up before written history and which is necessary for pursuing science as we have defined it so far. So much later, around 20,000 BCE, one of the consequences of effective tool use appears to be the extinction of the cave bear. In other words, humans are not only finding something to eat, they are ensuring that there are fewer opportunities to be eaten. They're actively controlling the environment. They're also taking care of themselves in other ways. I think that the long-haired Turkish Angora goat pictured here is a kind of walking sweater, and it would certainly inspire me to domesticate it if it got cold outside. And if I could get a dog to help me hunt, so much the better. At Johns Hopkins, the Center for a Livable Future has a food systems primer. It's a website, and it's interesting, and this is what it says about domestication and agriculture. From as early as 11,000 BCE, people began a gradual transition away from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle toward cultivating crops and raising animals for food. The shift to agriculture is believed to have occurred independently in several parts of the world, including northern China, Central America, and the Fertile Crescent. So, in various parts of the world, people are thinking to themselves, I think I'd like to have some animals to help me make it through this cold, dark, difficult world. Let's pause, though, and step back to 30,000 BCE, the Ice Age, in a cave in France, Chavy. Discovered in 1994 by spelunkers and named after one of the discoverers, this cave has something other than domestication, eating, or tool use. Just take a look at the incredible beauty and power of these representations and how easily these species are recognized. These are species that we can name. Some of these paintings required some kind of scaffolding to paint on the ceilings of the cave, and some parts of the black lines are not charcoal, but manganese which came from 150 miles away. So here we have a reaction to the environment, to nature, to food sources, But for what purpose? There's effort and work and intensity here. Some of these paintings required some kind of scaffolding to paint on the ceilings of the caves, and some parts of the black lines are not charcoal, but manganese, which came from 150 miles away. So here we have a reaction to nature, to the environment, to food sources, but for what purpose? There's effort and work and intensity here. Really with absolutely no proof whatsoever, because nobody wrote anything down, I feel as if the artist really liked watching lions hunt because he did draw them. Art brings us into the presence of a mind at work, considering and feeling, and even know if we don't really know exactly what that person was considering or feeling. Well, if you've never seen these before and you think this art is fabulous or interesting, and you want to spend a moment learning more, I've put a link into a 3D representation of this cave. I will admit freely at this point that a lot of my lectures have a certain squirrel feature to them. I'm distracted by things that are beautiful or interesting for reasons other than the argument I'm making at the moment, and I imagine that you might be too. So from time to time the squirrel will appear, and I'll give you some links in the text and you can go chase them down. Here are decorated reindeer bones from France, from the Paleolithic, and absolutely beautifully carved, beautiful representations. And here is one of my favorites, a mammoth made out of mammoth ivory, and I just think the trunk and the tail are so incredibly cute. And again, I put a link in here to a really nice little video that will help you if you want to see these more in depth. But what do we find humans doing before they do even animals? The thing that they do first is represent themselves. And these are the oldest images we find. They are humans putting their hands on the wall. How did they do that? Well, they did that with a kind of a bone, and they would take a mouthful of ochre and they would blow it through the bone, and they would put their hand on the wall and they'd blow the ochre over the hand, and they would make that negative imprint. Or they would just dip their hand in the ochre and make a positive imprint. So I just want to say at this point, I think this kind of action is necessary for science to begin. You need some kind of sense of self-concept, some kind of even a group project in self-concept, because these hands are all over the wall together. I think it matters to the ability to process the world around and ask questions of it. So for me, the ability to do science is co-equal with the ability to do art and to identify yourself as a self. Now, how else do early humans represent the human form? That's a more complex question. About 26,000 BCE is when scholars placed the first known portrait. It's possibly a woman, although that's not absolutely certain, but that it is a portrait is argued very strongly by the scholars of the Ice Age. The British Museum has a particular curator that is focused on the Ice Age, Jill Cook. And she said the reason we say this is a portrait is because she has an absolutely individual characteristics. She has one beautifully engraved eye, and on the other the lid comes over and there's just a slit. Perhaps she had a stroke or palsy, or she was injured in some way. In any case, she had a dodgy eye, and she had a little dimple on her chin. This is the image of a real living woman. Throughout the world, during this period, there are quite a few abstract representations of the female body. The Venus of Brassempouy is famous for having a head. She's there on the left. Most sculptures do not have a face. They actually focus on the genitalia and the sexual characteristics. The Willendorf Venus on the right has this marvelously molded body, little arms resting on the tops of the breasts, and a head with just hair, no other features, and her knees and her genitalia carved out very clearly. Now the Malta Venus has a hood, and some marks, possibly like a fur covering or clothes, are being represented, and there are a series like her. So maybe specific and focused representations, what we might call a ritualistic representation like the Willendorf Venus, is a way to control or marshal or even celebrate the forces of nature. If you keep repeating specific characteristics, you're obviously interested in that and trying to think about that or possibly control it. And maybe something like a realistic observation, maybe the Brassempouy Venus or the Moravian sculpture head or even some of the bison, is an attempt at remembering and representing something. It's hard to say for sure, but I would say these patterns of thinking, remembering, representing, focusing, these are things that would be required for science. And so I want to argue that people in this period had the capacity to do what we think of as science, to think, plan, predict, and to observe. And here is something that has been a little controversial, but I think it's relatively straightforward. This is a prehistoric artifact from about 32,000 BCE. It is argued to be the first lunar calendar. Someone is tracking time. Someone is looking at what's going on in the heavens and representing it on something so that they can know what's going to happen next. And this particular Marshak bone was discovered by a journalist. He did all the work to figure out what he thought it was, and it's generally accepted by scientists at NASA who feature it and said this about it. The archaeological record's earliest data that speaks to human awareness of the stars and heavens dates to the Aurignacian culture of Europe, about 32,000 BC. Between 1964 and the early 1990s, Alexander Marshak published breakthrough research that documented the mathematical and astronomical knowledge of the late Upper Paleolithic cultures of Europe. Marshak deciphered sets of marks carved into animal bones and occasionally on the walls of caves as records of the lunar cycle. These marks are sets of crescents or lines. They carefully controlled the thickness of the line so that a correlation with the lunar phases would be as easy as possible to perceive. This is the most recent research with a ton of buzz around it. This is the work of Genevieve von Petzinger, and she has compiled an archive of geometric signs across 40,000 to 10,000 BCE and found that there are not hundreds and not 5, but about 32. They're repeated cave after cave across Europe. That's pretty interesting. She's got a great book you might like to read called The First Signs: Unlocking the Mystery of the World's Oldest Symbols. Her argument is that people used, understood, and communicated through signs in the Ice Age. Well, let's get back to the book that we're going to read, because I'd like to just join up with Patricia Farah, who starts up the history of science with writing, with known writing. And she said that should be started with the Babylonians. And she said that, well, we'll start here. We'll say that generally ancient cultures used writing for business, religious worship, and legal purposes, and it first appears around 3400 BCE. But pretty quickly, you get the Babylonians writing down what they see as star observations. This is cuneiform, and this is a tablet recording the movements of Jupiter. And the argument by the folks who read this is that the Babylonians were doing calculus way before calculus was understood to be invented. And I've put a link in so that you can read about that if you'd like to. So, we can place prehistoric humans within the context of science by considering them as observers who faced problems and not only created tools to resolve those problems, but also communicated to each other and to us something of what they saw and felt. Well, we don't know what their organizing ideas were. I do think we can get a glimpse of a society's organizing ideas by looking at where there's repetition of items or actions or images. We know they observed the natural world repeatedly. They used a limited and fixed set of symbols over a lengthy period of time, and they solved the problems of eating, as well as extinction, as well as identity. In the next class, we'll take up science in the Bronze Age and look at Stonehenge and the way people managed time and seasons.